When America's grandest mansions were built, they were not conceived as indulgences detached from economic reality, nor were they the product of personal extravagance alone. They were the physical outcome of a financial engine that, for a brief but consequential period, made extreme private wealth both rational and structurally defensible. These estates were designed at a moment when money had outgrown traditional containers, when capital accumulation had accelerated faster than regulation, and when land offered a way to translate abstract financial power into something stable, visible, and enduring. At the end of the 19th century, the United States entered a phase of economic expansion unlike anything it had previously experienced. Industrial output surged, national markets integrated, and new financial instruments allowed wealth to compound at unprecedented rates. Fortunes generated by railroads, energy, finance, and heavy industry did not simply grow. They accumulated in ways that overwhelmed existing norms of storage and management. Banks were unstable, markets were prone to sudden contraction, and legal frameworks for capital were still evolving. For the families at the top of this system, the problem was no longer how to make money, but how to prevent it from being exposed to the very volatility that had helped create it. The mansion emerged as a solution to that problem, not as a residence in the ordinary sense, but as an economic structure capable of absorbing surplus capital while projecting legitimacy and control. A large estate could take in vast sums without appearing speculative. It could justify itself as productive rather than idle. Most importantly, it could operate under a different set of economic rules than purely financial assets. Land did not move quickly. Buildings did not evaporate during panics. Labor could be organized locally. In an unstable financial environment, slowness itself became a form of protection. This logic explains why estates of extraordinary scale appeared almost simultaneously across both Europe and the United States. In America, where industrial wealth rose rapidly and aristocratic traditions were absent, the mansion filled a symbolic and functional gap. It transformed new money into old structures, anchoring recently accumulated capital in forms that suggested permanence and continuity. The size of these estates was not merely aesthetic. It reflected the volume of wealth that needed to be stabilized. Few examples capture this logic more clearly than Biltmore Estate. Often described as a mansion, it was in reality the core of a territorial system designed to behave like a private economy. Thousands of acres were assembled not simply for privacy or scenery, but to support agriculture, forestry, and controlled labor. The house itself functioned as an administrative and symbolic center, while the surrounding land operated as a buffer against market dependence. Together, they formed a structure intended to preserve wealth across generations. This approach was shaped by assumptions that, at the time, were entirely reasonable. There was no federal income tax. Labor protections were minimal. Environmental regulation was virtually non-existent. Large landholders could organize production internally, plan decades ahead, and amortize costs over long horizons without anticipating significant policy interference. Under these conditions, scale reduced risk. The larger the system, the more it could internalize costs, smooth variability, and insulate itself from external shocks. Extreme wealth during this period carried with it a belief in continuity. Fortunes were expected to persist, and economic planning reflected that expectation. Liquidity mattered less than control. Yield mattered less than stability. A mansion-based estate did not need to outperform financial markets to justify its existence. It needed only to reduce uncertainty and legitimize wealth in a society that still equated land ownership with authority and permanence. The promise of these estates lay in their apparent ability to function as financial engines without behaving like businesses in the modern sense. Agricultural output reduced household expenses. Timber provided intermittent revenue aligned with long planning cycles. Wages circulated locally, returning through rents and services tied to the estate. Meanwhile, external industrial and financial income continued to cover any shortfalls. The estate appeared to sustain itself, even though it was quietly subsidized by much larger systems operating beyond its boundaries. Prestige reinforced this arrangement. Large estates signaled discipline and longevity to peers, banks, and political actors. Visibility was not yet a liability. It was reputational collateral. By anchoring wealth in land and systems, owners reduced perceived risk elsewhere in their portfolios. The mansion thus supported the broader financial engine that had created it, creating a feedback loop between appearance and confidence. At the moment these estates were conceived, this model was not reckless. It was aligned with the structure of the economy itself. Capital was powerful, regulation was light, and land offered a rare combination of legitimacy and insulation. The financial engine that built America's grandest mansions promised stability in a volatile age and control in a rapidly expanding one. That promise, however, rested on conditions that would not remain fixed. The same scale that once protected wealth would later magnify its vulnerabilities, and the same permanence that legitimized capital would eventually attract pressure it could not deflect. If you want to understand how the financial engine behind these mansions actually generated the money that made them possible, let me know and I'll continue. The financial engine that built America's grandest mansions did not begin on manicured lawns or behind carved stone facades. It began inside systems that operated at a national scale, systems that converted geography, labor, and infrastructure into recurring cash flow with remarkable efficiency. The estates were downstream expressions of that engine, not its source. To understand how such mansions became possible, it is necessary to examine where the money actually came from and why it arrived with such consistency that it could be committed to projects measured in decades rather than years. At the center of this engine stood infrastructure capitalism. Railroads, utilities, and extractive industries formed the backbone of late 19th century wealth creation. These were not competitive consumer markets governed by preference and branding. They were systems of necessity. Railroads determined which regions could access national markets and at what cost. Utilities locked customers into long-term dependence. Coal, steel, timber, and oil extracted value from land at volumes previously unimaginable, often with minimal regulatory constraint. Ownership in these systems did not simply produce profits. It produced control over cash flow. Railroads, in particular, generated a form of income that felt almost automatic to those who owned them. Freight moved regardless of economic cycles because goods still had to travel. Passenger traffic grew alongside population expansion. Once tracks were laid, marginal costs declined while usage increased. Revenues scaled with national growth, while fixed assets anchored pricing power. Bonds financed expansion, dividends rewarded equity holders, and financial houses earned fees underwriting both. Money flowed not because of constant innovation, but because the system itself had become indispensable. This mattered because it shaped how wealth was experienced. For families embedded in these networks, income was predictable. Trust distributed cash regularly. Interest payments arrived on schedule. Exposure to day-to-day market fluctuation was limited by scale and diversification across regions. When income behaves this way, capital planning changes. Long commitments become feasible. Large, illiquid investments no longer appear reckless. They appear prudent. The same logic applied across other industrial sectors. Steel production expanded alongside rail construction and urban growth. Energy demand rose with electrification and manufacturing. Timber extraction accelerated to supply both industry and housing. These sectors benefited from weak labor protections and limited oversight, allowing owners to capture a larger share of output. Wages remained low relative to productivity, and surplus flowed upward into ownership structures that compounded it through reinvestment. By the time the mansion entered the picture, Much of this wealth already existed as excess. Financial markets of the era added another layer. While they enabled rapid accumulation, they were also prone to panic. Liquidity could vanish. Overnight, banks failed with little warning. Securities fluctuated wildly in value. For those holding large fortunes, this volatility created an incentive to move part of their wealth into assets, governed by different dynamics. Land and estates did not promise high returns, but they promised continuity. They moved slowly. They absorbed capital without reacting violently to shocks. This is where the estate's role becomes clear. It was not designed to replace the financial engine that created the wealth. It was designed to stabilize its output, converting surplus capital into. Land allowed owners to diversify across economic behaviors. Financial assets responded to markets. Land responded to time. Agriculture followed seasons. Forestry followed growth cycles measured in decades. Together, these elements reduced overall volatility, even if they reduced peak returns. Labor economics reinforced this stability. Rural regions offered abundant labor with limited alternative employment. Large estates could dominate local labor markets, setting terms that favored predictability over competition. Wages flowed out, but much of that money returned through rents. Estate-run services and local commerce aligned with the estate's interests. From a systems perspective, labor costs were partially internalized, turning payroll into a mechanism for recycling cash, rather than a pure expense. Tax policy further supported this arrangement. Before the introduction of federal income taxation, recurring claims on wealth were modest. Property taxes existed, but they were small relative to industrial income. Holding wealth and land did not trigger continuous fiscal drag. Estate planning focused on continuity rather than minimization. Under these conditions, converting money into land was not only stable but efficient. Prestige played a quieter role in this engine. Ownership of a large estate signaled permanence and discipline to peers, lenders, and political actors. In an era when trust was personal and reputational, this mattered. The mansion functioned as reputational collateral, reinforcing confidence in the broader financial structures that produced its funding. The appearance of stability supported the reality of cash flow, creating a feedback loop between perception and finance. The critical point is that estates printed money only indirectly. They did so by lowering cash outflows, stabilizing costs, and absorbing surplus generated elsewhere. As long as the upstream industrial and financial systems continued to perform, the estate's internal inefficiencies remained masked. The mansion appeared to sustain itself, even though it was quietly subsidized by engines operating far beyond its boundaries. This relationship would hold only as long as those upstream systems remained dominant and lightly constrained. The moment their cash flows slowed, fragmented, or came under new pressure, the estate's dependence on them would become visible. Understanding how the money was made clarifies why the model felt so durable at first, and why its vulnerability was not immediately apparent. If you want to see how this externally generated wealth was deliberately engineered into a self-contained system on the ground, let me know, and I'll continue. Once surplus capital had been converted into land, the next challenge was not construction, but coordination. America's grand estates were designed to function less like homes and more like managed enterprises, even if they avoided the language of business. At Biltmore Estate, the financial engine took shape through deliberate choices about how land, labor, and prestige would interact to reduce volatility, preserve value, and extend the useful life of wealth across generations. The first principle was internalization. Wherever possible, the estates sought to replace market dependence with in-house capacity. Agriculture was organized to supply the household and workforce before it pursued external sales. Dairy operations, livestock, orchards, and vegetable production converted labor into food, transforming what would have been recurring cash expenses into predictable internal output. Even when surplus entered local markets, The primary financial benefit was cost avoidance rather than profit maximization. Stability, not margin, guided decisions. Forestry extended this logic over longer horizons. Timber was treated as a reserve asset rather than a commodity to be liquidated quickly. Selective harvesting aligned income with favorable market conditions while preserving the underlying capital. Standing forests represented deferred revenue that could be realized without selling land, a crucial distinction in a system built for permanence. This patience converted time itself into a financial tool, smoothing cash flows in ways that purely financial assets could not. Labor was organized as a semi-contained ecosystem. Large estates employed hundreds of workers across farming, forestry, maintenance, and domestic service, many of whom lived on estate-owned land. Housing, utilities, and services were often tied to employment, creating a closed loop in which wages circulated internally. From a financial perspective, payroll became partially self-reinforcing. Money paid out returned through rents and estate-aligned. Commerce, reducing leakage and dampening volatility. Management structures reinforced control. Supervisors coordinated operations across departments, aligning planting schedules with maintenance, cycles, and staffing levels with seasonal needs. Decisions were centralized, allowing the estate to prioritize predictability over local optimization. The mansion itself functioned as an administrative hub, housing records, offices, and logistical infrastructure that tied disparate activities into a coherent system. Architecture served governance as much as comfort. Prestige economics operated alongside these tangible mechanisms, hosting influential visitors, demonstrating modern management practices, and projecting order all produced indirect financial benefits. Social capital reduced transaction costs elsewhere, facilitated access to credit, and reinforced political goodwill. In an era when trust was personal, the estate's appearance of stability mattered. It justified continued investment and protected external income streams that subsidized internal operations. Vertical integration completed the system. Workshops, storage facilities, and specialized staff reduced reliance on external suppliers. Repairs could be handled internally, materials sourced on-site, and adjustments implemented without market delays. This increased fixed costs, but it reduced uncertainty, a trade-off that made sense in an economy where external markets were volatile and internal coordination was comparatively cheap. Crucially, none of this required the estate to be profitable in isolation. The financial logic assumed ongoing support from industrial and financial income generated elsewhere. As long as those upstream engines continued to perform, the estate's role was to stabilize wealth, preserve value, and legitimize capital in physical form. Losses were tolerable, inefficiencies acceptable, because survival did not depend on internal performance alone. For a time, this system worked as intended. Costs were predictable, operations were stable, and the estate appeared to function as a self-contained economic unit. Money flowed in, circulated internally, and rarely demanded attention. The mansion felt less like a liability and more like a mechanism, quietly converting scale into security. Yet this apparent autonomy concealed a growing rigidity. Internalization increased fixed commitments. Long planning horizons reduced adaptability. Control came at the expense of flexibility. These traits were advantages only as long as the external environment remained favorable. When conditions began to change, the same features that once stabilized the system would amplify stress. If you want to understand how the hidden costs of this carefully engineered system began to surface and erode its efficiency, let me know and I'll continue. At the moment when America's grand estates appeared most secure, the financial engine that sustained them was already carrying a growing load of costs that rarely appeared in celebratory narratives. These costs were not the result of extravagance or neglect. They were the natural consequence of scale, permanence, and internalization, the very qualities that had once made the estate model seem invulnerable. At properties such as Biltmore Estate, hidden costs accumulated. Quietly, year after year, transforming a system designed to stabilize wealth into one that demanded constant financial attention. Maintenance was the most immediate and inescapable of these burdens. A mansion of this scale was not a finished object, but a living system. Stone facades shifted with temperature and moisture. Roofs required continual inspection. Drainage systems needed constant upkeep to prevent water intrusion that could compromise entire wings. Interiors experienced steady wear from daily use by hundreds of occupants and staff. Because nearly every element was custom-built, repairs could not be standardized or outsourced cheaply. Each intervention required specialized labor and bespoke solutions, turning routine upkeep into a permanent structural expense. Mechanical systems intensified this pressure. Early heating, plumbing, and power installations were advanced for their time, but they aged poorly as standards of comfort and efficiency evolved. Retrofitting was technically difficult and financially disruptive, yet leaving systems unchanged increased fuel consumption and labor requirements. Small inefficiencies compounded across vast square footage, producing operating costs that rose steadily even in the absence of expansion. What had once been a triumph of engineering became a source of continuous drag. Labor, initially a stabilizing force, gradually hardened into a fixed cost structure. Skilled workers familiar with the estate's unique infrastructure were difficult to replace, creating dependency that reduced flexibility. Staffing levels could not be easily adjusted without risking operational failure. Beyond wages, housing, utilities, food provision, and supervision added layers of expense that persisted regardless of output. Over time, payroll shifted from a partially internalized loop into a rigid obligation that resisted downsizing. The surrounding land also carried underestimated costs. Agricultural operations required ongoing investment in equipment, livestock, and soil management. Forestry demanded road maintenance, replanting, and long periods during which capital remained tied up without immediate return. Fences, outbuildings, and internal transportation networks expanded the maintenance footprint far beyond a mansion itself. Each additional acre increased prestige, but it also multiplied obligations that could not be easily shed. Administrative complexity introduced another layer of friction. Coordinating farming, forestry, maintenance, and household operations required layers of management that did not directly produce output. Decision-making slowed as systems became more interconnected and inefficiencies became harder to isolate. Improvements in one area often raised costs in another, creating trade-offs that reduced overall efficiency. Integration, once a source of stability, became a constraint on adaptation. Opportunity cost operated quietly in the background. Capital locked into land, buildings, and internal infrastructure could not be redeployed as financial markets matured and offered higher returns with greater liquidity. While estates preserved value, they did not compound it at the pace of newer investment vehicles. Over decades, this divergence mattered. Wealth that might have grown elsewhere was instead consumed by the effort required to keep the estate unchanged. Social expectations imposed their own form of cost. Maintaining the appearance of effortless permanence required continuous spending on presentation, hospitality, and conformity to elite norms. These expenses were difficult to reduce without diminishing prestige, yet they generated no direct financial return. The estate had to look stable even as the resources required to sustain that image increased. None of these costs alone threatened immediate collapse. Together, they narrowed the margin for error. The estate no longer needed to fail dramatically to become unsustainable. It needed only to exist in an environment where costs rose faster than the external income streams that had once absorbed them without notice. Scale, which had once insulated the system, now magnified every inefficiency and limited flexibility. By the time these hidden costs were fully visible, the financial logic of the estate had already shifted. What once functioned as a stabilizing engine for wealth had become a structure that required constant effort simply to avoid decline. If you want to see how broader economic shifts finally push this system past its breaking point, let me know and I'll continue. The breaking point for the financial engine behind America's grandest mansions did not arrive as a single event, nor did it announce itself as a crisis. It emerged gradually through a convergence of structural changes that altered the environment these estates had been designed to operate within. By the early 20th century, the assumptions that once made large, privately run estates economically coherent were being revised, one, by forces beyond the control of any individual owner. At estates such as Biltmore Estate, the system did not collapse abruptly. It lost alignment. Fiscal transformation was the most direct source of pressure. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 marked a fundamental shift in how private wealth interacted with the state. For the first time, income generated by industrial holdings faced systematic, recurring claims. What had once flowed almost entirely into reinvestment, maintenance, or long-term planning was now partially diverted each year. Progressive taxation compounded this effect, and later additions, including estate and inheritance taxes, altered the intergenerational calculus that had justified holding vast, illiquid assets. Permanence, once a virtue, made valuation easier and avoidance more difficult. Labor economics reinforced this shift. Industrialization and urban growth expanded employment opportunities beyond rural estates, weakening the estate's ability to dominate local labor markets. At the same time, labor standards formalized expectations around wages, hours, and working conditions. Arrangements that had once relied on paternalism and limited mobility became subject to regulation and scrutiny. Compliance raised costs and reduced discretion, turning labor from a stabilizing input into a rising fixed obligation. The estate could no longer internalize labor cheaply, nor could it easily reduce staff without risking operational failure. Market integration further undermined the estate model. Agricultural prices became more volatile as national and international markets synchronized, erasing the predictability that estate farming depended on. Timber markets cycled independently of the estate's cash needs, weakening forestry's role as a stabilizer. Meanwhile, financial markets matured, offering liquid instruments that combined diversification with returns that outpaced land-based operations. In comparison, estates appeared increasingly inefficient, tying up capital and assets that required continuous expenditure simply to maintain value. Social and political attitudes toward concentrated wealth also evolved. Large private estates, once seen as symbols of order and progress, increasingly attracted skepticism. This shift did not dismantle estates directly, but it reshaped the policy environment. Support for regulation and redistribution grew, reducing the informal protections that prestige had once provided. Visibility, which had functioned as reputational collateral, became a source of exposure. The cumulative effect of these changes was margin compression. Operating costs rose steadily while the estate's contribution to overall wealth declined in relative terms. External income streams that had once subsidized inefficiencies faced their own constraints, narrowing the buffer that made the estate feel autonomous. The system did not fail outright. It inverted. What had been designed to stabilize wealth began to require stabilization itself. This moment matters because it clarifies that the model did not break due to mismanagement or extravagance. It broke because it was optimized for an economic order that no longer existed. Adjustments at the margins could delay consequences, but they could not restore alignment between scale and environment without abandoning the estate's defining characteristics. The mansion still stood, operations continued, and outward appearances changed little. But the financial engine that once justified its scale no longer operated on favorable terms. If you want to see how this misalignment transformed power in a liability and forced estates into a fundamentally different role, Let me know and I'll continue. Once the structural pressures crossed a critical threshold, the financial engine behind America's grandest mansions entered. A phase that was neither sudden collapse nor orderly wind down, but inversion. The same characteristics that had once converted wealth into stability now converted stability into obligation. At estates, such as Biltmore Estate, power did not disappear. It became expensive to maintain, slow to deploy, and increasingly constrained by forces external to the estate itself. The first sign of this inversion was persistent cash flow tension. Agricultural and forestry operations continued, but their revenues no longer aligned with the costs required to sustain the infrastructure that supported them. Maintenance spending rose predictably, labor expenses resisted reduction, and energy consumption climbed as systems aged. The estate shifted from optimization to defense, allocating capital to prevent deterioration rather than to generate incremental value. Money was no longer shaped by the system, it was absorbed by it. Incremental adjustments revealed the limits of scale. Staffing reductions saved wages but increased operational risk, as fewer hands meant slower maintenance cycles and greater wear on bespoke systems designed for constant attention. Deferred repairs conserved cash in the short term, but raised the probability of cascading failures with far higher future costs. Each decision traded one liability for another, narrowing options, rather than restoring balance. The estate's integrated design, once a strength, limited its ability to adapt piecemeal. Land, long treated as the ultimate reserve, became a store of trapped capital. Selling parcels provided liquidity, but weakened the internal coherence that justified integration. Agricultural and forestry units lost scale, raising per-unit costs and reducing flexibility. Over time, divestment addressed immediate needs at the expense of long-term resilience, converting strategic assets into tactical stopgaps that eroded the estate's original logic. The estate's relationship with its surrounding economy also changed. Where it had once dominated local labor and commerce, increasingly operated within competitive markets. Workers gained alternatives, suppliers demanded market terms, and local dependence diminished. Informal subsidies of influence and centrality faded, replaced by explicit cash costs that could not be negotiated away. The estate's size no longer conferred leverage, it magnified exposure. The most consequential transformation was conceptual. The mansion ceased to be evaluated primarily as a private financial system and began to be understood as an asset whose value lay outside production. Historical significance, cultural interest, and public curiosity emerged as alternative sources of revenue. Opening the property to visitors converted prestige into income, transforming attention into cash flow at a moment when traditional operations could no longer justify the scale of expenditure. This was adaptation, not capitulation, but it marked the end of the original model. Public access brought its own constraints. Staffing, compliance, and accelerated were introduced new costs, and revenue became sensitive to broader economic cycles. Yet this transition provided a path to continuity that private funding alone could no longer guarantee. The mansion no longer stabilized wealth by internalizing production. It sustained itself by externalizing value through visibility. Power persisted, but in a different form. Authority gave way to stewardship, and exclusivity was replaced by managed relevance. Decisions increasingly prioritized preservation over accumulation and sustainability over dominance. The estate remained impressive, but its role within the wealth structures that had created was fundamentally altered. This phase reveals the final paradox of old money estates. They endure not because their original financial logic remains intact, but because they relinquish it. Survival is achieved by surrendering the conditions that once defined power. If you want to understand why this kind of mansion-based wealth system cannot realistically return in modern capitalism, let me know and I'll continue. By the time America's grandest mansions completed their transition from private financial engines into managed institutions, the economic conditions that had once justified their existence were no longer recoverable. The disappearance of the mansion-based wealth model was not a cultural preference or a shift in taste. It was the outcome of deep structural changes that permanently altered how capital moves, how risk is managed, and how power is expressed in modern capitalism. The model did not fall out of use. It lost compatibility with the environment that surrounds wealth today. The most decisive change lies in the behavior of capital itself. In the era that produced estates like Biltmore Estate, capital was slow, territorial, and difficult to redeploy. Large investments locked owners into place, and exit carried high cost and uncertainty. Under those conditions, transforming financial surplus into land and self-contained systems reduced exposure to instability. Today, capital is liquid, global, and continuously repriced. Wealth can move across asset classes, borders, and structures with speed and precision. In such an environment, concentrating enormous resources into a single immobile estate is not conservative. It is restrictive. Taxation reinforces this. Incompatibility. Modern fiscal systems are built to identify, value, and tax large physical assets on an ongoing basis. Property taxes, income taxes, inheritance taxes, and compliance costs apply, regardless of whether an estate generates sufficient cash flow to justify its scale. Unlike earlier periods, when taxation was limited and often negotiable, contemporary systems treat visibility as exposure. Permanence no longer shields wealth. It attracts recurring obligation. Labor economics further prevent a return to the old model. The semi-contained labor ecosystems that once allowed estates to internalize payroll depended on limited worker mobility and weak regulation. Those conditions no longer exist. Labor now commands market wages, legal protections, and geographic freedom. Internalizing labor at scale increases fixed costs without delivering stability. What once reduced volatility now amplifies it. Prestige has also inverted its function. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, permanence and territorial dominance signaled legitimacy and discipline. Today, prestige flows from flexibility, innovation, and network position. Monumental private estates no longer lower perceived risk. They invite scrutiny, regulation, and social pressure. The reputational return on visibility has declined, while the reputational cost has risen. Attempts to recreate the mansion-based wealth model reveal this shift clearly. Modern large estates are planned as businesses from inception, structured around tourism, hospitality, branding, or institutional partnerships. These ventures can succeed, but they operate under fundamentally different logic. They require constant market engagement, continuous reinvestment, and sensitivity to consumer demand. The original model assumed continuity without adaptation. Modern capitalism punishes that assumption. The contrast between old money and new money strategies underscores the point. Old money sought to anchor wealth in place, converting abstract capital into physical systems that could be managed across generations. New money prioritizes optionality. It disperses assets, maintains liquidity, and avoids structures with high fixed costs and limited exit paths. Where estates once converted wealth into control, they now convert wealth into constraint. What survives of the mansion model is, therefore, historical, not strategic. These estates endure as cultural assets, educational sites, and managed enterprises, not as templates for modern wealth preservation. They mark the outer boundary of what private capital could once build under conditions of light regulation, constrained labor, and land-based legitimacy. That boundary has moved, and it has not moved back. Understanding why this model cannot return matters because it strips away nostalgia and clarifies the real lesson. The estates did not fail because their owners lacked foresight. They became obsolete because the environment that rewarded their logic disappeared. Capital did not abandon scale. It abandoned immobility. If you want to draw this entire story together and extract the broader financial lesson it holds for wealth today, let me know and I'll continue. When the full arc of America's grandest mansions is viewed through a financial lens, their story resolves into a lesson about alignment rather than excess. Estates like Biltmore Estate did not rise because their owners misunderstood money, nor did they decline because they spent too freely. They rose because their structures matched the economic environment of their time, and they declined because that environment changed in ways that made those same structures increasingly inefficient to hold. At their peak, these mansions functioned as stabilizers of surplus capital. They translated volatile industrial and financial income into land, labor systems, and long-duration assets that behaved slowly and predictably. In an era marked by financial panics, weak regulation, and limited institutional safeguards, this slowness was protective. Illiquidity reduced exposure. Scale internalized risk. Control substituted for diversification. The mansion did not need to outperform markets. It needed to dampen uncertainty while legitimizing wealth in physical form. This is why the idea that estates printed money is both true and misleading. They did not generate extraordinary profits on their own. They conserved money by reducing leakage. Food production lowered household costs. Forestry deferred income into the future. Wages circulated locally and partially returned through rents and services. Most importantly, the estate absorbed surplus that might otherwise have remained exposed to market volatility. As long as upstream industrial engines continued to produce abundant cash flow, the estate's internal inefficiencies remained tolerable and often invisible. What ultimately failed was not the mansion, but the assumptions embedded within it. As taxation became systematic, labor markets opened, capital mobility increased, and financial instruments matured, the comparative advantage of land-based wealth collapsed. The same permanence that once protected capital became a magnet for recurring costs and scrutiny. The same scale that once smoothed volatility magnified rigidity. The estate did not suddenly become poorly managed. It became misaligned. This distinction reframes decline as structural rather than personal. Old money did not lose discipline. It lost an environment that rewarded permanence and control. The transition from private financial engine to managed institution was not an admission of defeat. It was an adaptation to new constraints. By opening estates to the public, partnering with institutions, and prioritizing preservation over accumulation, owners exchanged autonomy for continuity. Wealth stopped flowing through the estate. The estate endured by changing what it was for. The broader lesson extends beyond historic mansions. Every era produces assets that appear unassailable within their own context. They reflect prevailing beliefs about stability, risk, and the future of capital. Over time, those beliefs are tested by structural change. Assets that can adapt survive with their purpose intact. Assets built for permanence often survive only by being reframed. The mansion that once anchored wealth teaches that durability is not the same as sustainability, and that preservation is often the final phase of systems built for accumulation. Modern wealth operates on a different logic. It prioritizes flexibility over monumentality, dispersion over concentration, and exit over permanence. This does not make the old model foolish. It makes it historical. Estates like Biltmore endure because they accepted the inversion of their original purpose and adapted to a world that no longer rewards the conditions that created them. The financial engine that built America's grandest mansions was real, coherent, and powerful in its time. Its decline was not a failure of imagination, but a reminder that wealth must continuously renegotiate its relationship with labor, regulation, and society. When that negotiation ends, even the most impressive structures become obligations, rather than instruments. If you want to continue exploring how wealth builds systems, outgrows them, and learns to move on, consider subscribing and joining me for more long-form analyses on the Mansion economy.